So what was the differences between that particular time when you first got in to when you had maybe your first 10, 15 years in the department, like in the 80s?
Yeah, I think, the 80s, 80s into the 90s, I spent quite a while in the narcotics vice division. I got into narcotics. Originally, I went to the morals detail for a few months, and then knowing that I was going to go to the narcotics side of things, I ended up getting assigned to the airport. This is when we kind of saw the influx of drugs. Prior to this, there was cocaine in the clubs. Everybody had their own little marijuana stash, but nobody got out of control. The cocaine was becoming an issue, but it wasn't a big problem.
That's when the whole war on drugs really started in the 80s.
In the 80s, yes. Because now we actually started to see an influx of larger and more amounts of drugs. I remember starting off, we worked the airport task force with the Drug Enforcement Administration, and we'd get cases with ounces of cocaine, pills, marijuana here and there. I mean, I think the biggest marijuana case we had at the airport was a 75-pound box of marijuana. And I remember it was a guy who was convicted of murder on the Big Island, and he was out doing this. But that influx of drugs really started to change things. Marijuana now became a very, how do I want to say it, a high-priced product. The further east it went on the United States, the higher the value. So you were looking at maybe a pound of marijuana here. Guys, they might scrape a pound together, smoke it, big deal. As it started going to the mainland, it was $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 dollars a pound. And guys here began to realize, hey, we can make money. I don't have the marijuana plant in my backyard for me and my friends to smoke anymore. I can go and create fields.
Entrepreneurship.
Yep, we started exactly. And I've always said drugs are the best example of the economy, supply and demand.
Correct.
It's exactly that, because we saw the prices fluctuate, we saw the supply fluctuate. Interesting. So on Oahu, we had small patches of marijuana. We saw it in the cane fields, but it began to grow, and the use, of course, here grew. Not only were they shipping it away, but there was more use here. Big Island, green harvest. They were growing it by the, I want to say acre. It's not exactly true, but I mean, there were some large grow operations there. Again, because they were making money. Guys were making 6- and 7-figure incomes off marijuana
back in the 80s.
Back in the 80s. And then we started to see that, like I said, that big influx of cocaine. Remember now I said we'd catch guys, and because we were like the prime narcotic unit at the time, other guys in narcotics too, they'd work their way, long-term investigations, but we get ounces, rarely ever a pound. And then you get to the late 80s, 1984, the mid 80s, I should say, we started seeing pound cases and then kilo cases of cocaine coming in. And it came in through all sorts of things. And, everybody starts using it here. Supply was high. The cost was relatively cheap. Everybody was using it. We started to see overdose deaths, and we never tracked those before. Later, we can talk about how the oxy problem led to us tracking overdose deaths. But back then, there was a singer, Billy Cowie, with Country Comfort, I believe was a group. He died on the dance floor from cocaine use. And his sister was our time clerk in the Narcotics Vice Division at that time,
Wow.
But everybody...
It's a small island, yeah.
Yeah. That's how we all knew somebody. I mean, everybody had a problem. And the police department just started to begin to test the officers for drug use.
Oh, prior to that, there was no?
Prior to that, there was no drug testing.
Huh?
Yeah. So this was the mid 80s when it started. And then towards the end of the 80s into the 90s, we start seeing the influx of the ice, batu, the methamphetamine, crystal methamphetamine. That just took off, and that created a lot of problems because now guys were really getting hooked. With the cocaine, so. But with the ice, like some guys say, use it once and you're hooked.
Yeah.
So these, it took off exponentially. Now we were seizing multi kilos of the drug at the smuggling points or even on the street, and it just deteriorated the family units.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I wanted to ask
yeah.
on. Like, is the influx of drugs and the drugs during the 80s and into the 90s, is that one of the reasons, in your opinion, that a lot of the dynamic for society's outlook on how police treat each other or treat the public and vice versa kind of changed? That dynamic kind of went away from just a community-oriented police department more towards like a us versus them?
You could see a breakdown in the social structure, I guess. Problems were happening at home because guys were going out to the disco, they'd come home, they were carrying guns now. We never saw too many gun cases prior to that. Now in the 80s into the 90s, we start seeing guys going to discos, everybody's carrying a gun. You never had that many shootings. But it starts breaking down the whole fiber of the society because I want the drug. I don't care about my wife, my children.
The demand is high.
Yeah. So you see that breakdown, and what do we do as law enforcement? We weren't trained to handle the social aspect of it. We enforced the law.
Yep.
I mean, it was pretty black and white what we could and couldn't do. Now you're getting children that are left at home while mom and dad are out drinking and doing drugs. So all of a sudden, hey, we got to take the children. We're calling, the Child Protective Service at 2:00 in the morning to come get these kids. So you see the fiber start breaking down, and business starts booming. You see a growth in tourism. Downtown starts changing. Again, during the daytime, you got your business, your banking, everything is pretty straight. Nighttime, it's becoming much more seedy. You're starting to have a deterioration where there were unwritten rules. You only went this far, you only went that far. Now there's the mixing, and then there's also the clash of the different ethnic groups, the different violators, if you want to say that, between prostitutes and Maois. There's no boundary anymore. It's starting to expand. It's starting to go to Ala Park. It's starting to go more.
So you have an influx of drugs, you have an influx of these, highly addictive drugs that deteriorate someone's life, in addition to the influx of population.
Yes, both. We start to see the population grow. Prior to that, I mean, everybody still kind of knew everybody. It was still a bit of old Hawaii. I think in the 80s and the 90s, you really started to see that change. You started to see foreign investment come in. You started to see more high rises.
That's like when the Japanese tourists really started to come.
Yes. It was about that time period. And you saw business. There was a lot of Japanese tourists came. They flew on Japanese planes. They rode Japanese buses. They stayed in Japanese hotels. So you had organized crime. I never mentioned this about the 70s and 80s, but earlier part of the 80s. You had local organized crime, which made a lot of their money off gambling. But you make money quick and fast off gambling, but you make more money off drugs. So now you start seeing that. And it's the same like you hear about the mafia. They never got delved into the drugs because it's too risky and all that. Well, organized crime went that way too. And even with the Japanese, we started seeing the Yakuza have a pretty good presence in the 80s and 90s here in Hawaii. The triads started coming in, the Chinese triads. There were a lot of things that started to change and erode that fiber of our community life, our family lives. So you saw less respect towards the policeman, and the policeman, and when I say policeman, I'm using that term generically. I'm not offending women or men.
The police officers.
Yes. There was just that erosion. People that were pushing it more because of the drug use. I mean, You had to deal with more drunks. You dealt with more addicts, and there were more people starting to live on the street. Not nearly what we got now.
Yeah, there had to have been a drastic change in the homeless population, because before in the 70s, you were talking about like just bums, just homeless bums, people that just didn't have a residence to live in. And now, well, not now, but after that, in the 90s, you have these actual drug addicts who are now the homeless population.
Well, and then with the building, you actually see people getting pushed out because there's nowhere to stay. The old places that they could rent and could afford no longer were there. So, they're using drugs, they're drinking, they're out on the street. So you're seeing a little bit, but it's drug related and it's alcohol related. It's still not so much of a social problem like how we see it now, where you see the mentally challenged people, people who are just resistant to living in a home or rules, and all the other problems that come along with it. So the 80s and 90s was a start there. And it just progressed from there. But I guess I would call that the Middle Ages, even though it's right around the middle of my career as well. It's kind of the Middle Ages. You see the transition.
You were dating yourself when you call the middle of your career the Middle Ages.
Yeah. You started to see a change, definite change. Who was responsible? Well, a lot of people. I mean, the government let it go. And I'm not trying to be political or anything, but there's an expansion. It's good for business. It's good for the government. Your tax revenue increases. The police department kind of stayed stuck on that number for a long time, because even the detectives, in the 80s number of detectives was pretty current right up to not what it is now.
Are you talking about the number of
detectives assigned to either the districts or to the criminal investigation division? It's still pretty much the same number.
The population has constantly been growing.
Right. Well, the population grew, the department never grew. See, early on, what happened is when you built a house or you built a structure of some sort, you needed the police to stamp and sign off.
Oh, wow.
And then they said, no, we got to build faster. We got to build cheaper. Let's cut the police and fire department out of all this stuff. Let's cut the red tape. But what that did was, when they did that, they were able to track things. Now the police, if I'm going to put up a big tower, they will send you their schematics. You take a look at it and you think of the impact that it's going to have, and you submit your report on it. Does it have an impact on the permit? Not at all. They issued a permit anyway. So it's almost useless to even make a comment on something like that.
So if somebody wanted to build a condominium or something like that, like today you're doing these environmental impact studies and stuff like that, but you're saying back in those days, like there was a crime type impact studies that had to be done before you did those?
It got submitted to the police department. They would look where you were building, make sure that they had enough policemen in the area or police officers in the area. Okay. And they would stamp off before that. It was a way of controlling things in a sense, because if you started to build a whole subdivision, hey, wait a minute, I need more officers.
Right.
I can't do it with the existing, so I can't sign off on this unless you promise to get us more officers. And that's kind of the way things worked. Some of the beats were added since then, but I mean, we're looking at a bigger number of officers today, authorized number of officers, than what we had back then, but not a whole lot. You still got, like I said, the detectives were kind of just frozen for this whole time. So, I mean, you got more, the caseload has changed over that time period. The type of crimes has changed.
Definitely.
Because that fiber of society has eroded. And there's also more calls. You see, and again, it's not a comment on whether you're right or left, but that left liberalism started to pool on, okay, what do the police do? We need more help. Today, like they're saying, we need more psychologists. We need more social workers. The problem is that you can't respond to these homeless people who are mentally challenged, because they're going to hit you. They're going to assault you. They're going to do all kinds of things. You still have to have the police officers do this kind of work. Well, we're moving towards that at this time period, but we're not quite there yet. You still got a lot of backing for the police officers, but it's starting to deteriorate. It's just a time of change, I think, more than anything. And you can see it. Outside, the country districts are starting to get larger. They're starting to break up. At that time, I believe Kalihi actually separated from what's known as Central Honolulu, or District 1. So you started to get, I think you went to 5 districts. Eventually, we'll go to 6, 7, and 8. But it's all starting to happen around this time. Not only that, but you're starting to see the evolution of community policing, getting policemen to talk to people. And, we had that prior. You had a community relations team, actually division, and you had the Police Activities League. The officers were out there. In the 70s and 80s, I mean, you had thousands of kids that were involved. Now, again, you're getting into the 80s and 90s, you got less kids involved because that family structure is starting to break down.
Yeah, and I remember hearing about people talking about, hey, we need to get back to the neighborhood police officer. Well, we need the neighborhoods first. Like, you can't just have a neighborhood police officer. I mean, a lot of these neighborhoods are transient. You have people buying homes and moving out, or not owning the homes, or not being invested in the neighborhood. You have a neighborhood watch and nobody shows up. I mean, how do you have a neighborhood police officer if, the neighborhood themselves aren't willing to respect the police officer? And then you get the police officer to stay in that neighborhood and be invested in the neighborhood too.
Right. It's difficult because, just like you said, we don't have that neighborhood. We got transients. At this time, you still don't have the vacation rentals. There's a few, because I think the moratorium stopped in '86 from bed and breakfast. So you had a few, but the residents were there with the visitors so they kept them under control. You never had problems. It's not until after the 2000s you really start seeing that transition where criminals start attacking, people start buying houses. I remember having a guy come into the Kailua station grumbling about the way his neighbors treated him because he converted his home from a single-family rental, long-term rental, to a vacation rental. And he was driving the tourists nuts. And then we saw criminals actually start targeting these places. I had one guy tell me he knew how to go to the back door and the back gate and actually lift the latch so that he could get in. And then he'd watch the first day that the people were there. He'd hit them because they had the most to steal.